Up to this point, I've completed the case construction and base construction of my Krenov-inspired coffee table build, and in this video I'll cover the final details, the surface prep, assembly, and the finish. All of the outside edges of all of the proud joinery will get a chamfer, and with the case still in a dry assembly, it is a good opportunity to run a plane over both the pins and tails at the same time. Now I won't be able to, plane the chamfer around all edges while assembled, but this will give me a good idea of what looks good when it will be assembled and how deep the rest of the cuts of the chamfers need to be when it's disassembled. I also used a chisel to cut half of the opposite direction chamfers just to get a better idea for how it would look. Once I was happy with the chamfer depth, I used a straight edge against the outside of each joint to draw a reference line. Now this is just a visual guide to keep me mindful of the joint depth when I cut the chamfers. These joints were really tight when assembled, and there isn't much vertical space on the inside for disassembly, so luckily the joints were cut proud, which gives just enough material on the outside to break apart the joint. I started with the pins and went back and forth using a chisel and a block plane. And now I've used a chisel on a previous project to cut the chamfers, but this mahogany just wasn't cooperating too well with the chisel. The mahogany was cutting great, but it was a little bit more delicate than what I was used to, and I was getting a little bit of tear out on the backside, so I switched to a hand plane for everything. And it's pretty easy to get very consistent results so long as you lock your wrist and only use your elbow or shoulder to move your hand. The further away from the cutting edge that the pivot point is, the more consistent results you'll get. And the more you change the angle of your wrist, the more you'll accidentally change the angle of the chamfer face. And here's a good look at the completed pins. I did have one casualty though. On one side of the side half pins, I had a nasty bit of tear out that I think was caused by a tiny crack in the wood that I didn't really see. But this tear out would have been just painfully obvious when it was all completed, so I went ahead and repaired it. Now I wish I would have recorded the repair process, but I instantly went into repair mode and just forgot all about the camera. So here's the repair being glued into place. Now what I did is I made a straight cut with a dovetail saw to remove the tear out completely, and that left a flat glue face. And then I cut a similar wedge piece out of a previous offcut and just glued it into place. And then trimmed it flush as needed. If you take your time to really look at the grain to find the best grain match, then the patch will pretty much disappear. And if you look really closely, you can see the patch in this case. But you have to look really close, which is exactly what you want. Nobody is ever going to know that this was patched. After that, it's rinse and repeat for all of the tails. And here's a look at all of the tail chamfers. And here's a look at the case tenon chamfers. And it's more of the same with the base tenon chamfers. Lots of chamfers. Finally, all the chamfers are complete and the surface prep can begin. Now the long rail coves were the only thing that were sanded by hand on the base, and I started with 80 grit and then worked my way all the way up to 320 grit. Then every flat face on the base pieces is planed with a smoothing plane, and I try to do as much surface prep with hand planes as possible because it's so much faster than sanding, even when using an electric sander. Also, imagine if all of those shavings were on the bench in the form of dust. Not saying, throw away your sandpaper or sanders, it's just use them as little as possible. Hand planes and scrapers, they'll save you a tremendous amount of time. And right after saying all of that, I get to tell you that I used my random orbit sander for all of the mahogany pieces. I tried my smoothing plane first, but I wasn't liking the resulting texture on the quarter sawn areas of the mahogany. It just wasn't planing evenly across the panel. Some areas that were kind of flat sawn, some areas that are kind of quarter sawn. It was just easier to get more of a consistent result, in this case, by using the random orbit sander. Next up is actually the finish. I wanted to do as much of the finishing as possible before assembly. And the reason is, once assembled, there's going to be a lot of hard to reach interior corners, and with the finish applied before assembly, any glue squeeze out, all that's going to be a lot easier to remove. For a finish, I'm using Armor Seal Satin. My wife and I feel like a gloss finish feels a little bit too much like plastic, and satin feels closer to not having a finish, if that makes sense. Almost like it allows the wood grain to do more of the talking rather than, I guess, a shiny film finish. Now, obviously, I made sure to not put any finish on the glue joints, but I did put finish on the proud areas of all the tenons. This, again, will make glue cleanup a lot easier. After 2 coats of finish, the glue up can finally begin, and all of the joints on this project were really tight to begin with, and they all required a mallet to seat them in the dry assembly. So if water-based PVA glue was used for the final assembly, the joints would actually swell just a little bit and be even more difficult to seat. So instead, I used hide glue, which it somewhat acts as a lubricant to help seat the joints. It actually worked out really well. I was able to assemble all of the base joints by hand without using a mallet. Of course, I used a mallet to kind of tweak the angle a little bit just to make sure everything was square, but as far as seating the joints, all of that I was just able to just press it all together. Hide glue, in this case, is definitely the way to go. There's one final thing to do on the case before assembly, and that is a little relief cut needs to be made with a chisel on the inside edge of each of the tails. This doesn't really affect the strength of the joint, but it does allow a little bit of glue relief area, because sometimes if the joint is really tight to begin with, which in this case it is, the excess glue can prevent the joint from seating all the way if this relief cut isn't made. But even with the hide glue, these case joints were still pretty tight and required a bit of persuasion to close them up. And oh yeah, my brand new Harbor Freight 2-sided mallet fell apart, which is always fun. After assembly, all of the joints on the front and back face of the case were flushed up with a smoothing plane, and then all of the edges were broken with 320 grit sandpaper. I decided to leave the top tenons on the case proud, as they could always be flushed up later if I didn't like it, but on the bottom I went ahead and planed them flat and then sanded them to, I guess, better blend them with the bottom of the case, which is kind of pointless because due to expansion and contraction of seasonal humidity changes, the tenons on the bottom side are eventually going to be, you'll be able to feel them with your hands. And of course it's on the bottom side and it's never going to be seen, but whatever. A couple more coats of finish were still needed, so every assembled exterior face on both the case and the base were gently sanded with a fresh piece of 320 grit sandpaper and then vacuumed off before applying 2 more coats of finish. To attach a top to a base, I always use these tabletop hold-down clips. They're really inexpensive and you can buy them in bulk on Amazon, and they're super easy to implement. A biscuit joiner is used to cut the slots, and here you can see one cut in a scrap block to verify the biscuit joiner is set up correctly. The clip goes into the slot and is secured to the bottom of a tabletop with a screw. The slot connection allows the clip to not only hold the 2 pieces together, but it allows for movement of the top as it expands and contracts with seasonal changes in humidity. There's a few different ways to make the slot, but I found the biscuit joiner to be the simplest and most efficient. Once the base is positioned on the top, it's a good idea to clamp it in place to make sure it's exactly where it needs to be as it is secured. And finally, the project becomes a piece of furniture as the base is joined with the top. I recently had a conversation with a good friend of mine about this project, and he asked if I was nervous or apprehensive about making it due to all the design elements and all the opportunities to make mistakes, and my answer was it was an immediate and confident no. Probably the most involved piece on this project is the long rails with dual coves and offset chamfered through tenons, and that kind of sounds like a mouthful to say when you think about it as a complex piece on the design paper. But it's much less intimidating if you approach everything by just saying what it is in its most simple form. This is a cove cut on the table saw. That's not too difficult. This is a simple curved cut on the bandsaw. That's pretty easy to do. This is a tenon cut to one side of the board. Those are all straight cuts to form a rectangle, and these are 45-degree chamfers, which are pretty easy to do with a hand plane. So no matter how complex something might seem at first, it can always be broken down into very simple tasks. And here it is in my living room, and I think it needs one or two more coats of finish because it shows up on camera a couple of spots that I think I missed. But I can do that at any time. It also obviously needs the drawers, but I'm a little undecided on a couple of the details, so I'm going to take a break from this project and come back to it in a little bit. And also, a big quick shout out to my good friends at City Hardwoods in Birmingham, Alabama. They provided most of the lumber for this and also the finish for this build. So definitely check them out if you drive through Birmingham, Alabama. And if you have never been there before, be sure to tell them that Jay sent you. Not because I gain anything by doing so, I don't. But as a small business owner myself, I know that it's incredibly valuable to know where your traffic source is coming from. So anytime you're in Birmingham, Alabama, check them out. You'll be glad you did. That's it for this video. Subscribe so you don't miss the next video if you haven't already done so. Check out my website, jayscustomcreations.com, and sign up for my email newsletter to keep up to date with everything that I have going on. You guys take care, have a great day, and I will talk to you in the next video.